for having me here this evening, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the presentation. The presentation this evening is actually based on the work of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, A Decade of Eroding Tax Fairness in BC, Time for Progressive Tax Reform. Reducing inequality means tax increases at the top end. Currently in BC, the more income you make, the lower your overall tax rate. That's not the tax system British Columbians want or support. We need tax reform to ensure everyone pays their fair share. People at the top end can afford to pay their fair share, and upper income British Columbians are doing very well, and their incomes have risen sharply in recent years. The province should increase the tax rates that apply in the upper income tax brackets and introduce new upper income tax brackets for those making more than $100,000 a year. We all need to pitch in. It isn't just those who are wealthy who can and should contribute more in taxes. Most of us can contribute a little bit more as a share of our income to pay for the public services like home and community care for seniors, affordable housing, child care, environmental protection, public transit, and affordable post-secondary education. BC's taxes are very low compared to other provinces. Our economy will benefit from investments in areas like education and poverty reduction. Most British Columbians would agree that everyone should pay their fair share of taxes, and most assume that the wealthy pay more, not only in straight dollars, but also a higher tax rate as a share of their income. So most would probably be shocked to learn that in reality, that is no longer how our provincial tax system works. A 2011 CCPA report, BC's Regressive Tax Shift, A Decade of Diminishing Tax Fairness, 2000 to 2010, upon which this summary is based, examined changes to the provincial tax system over that 10-year period. It considered the total provincial tax rate for households at different income levels, the actual tax bill as a share of household income for all personal provincial taxes combined, income, sales, carbon and property taxes, and MSP premiums. Using a Statistics Canada database that draws on tens of thousands of tax files, it found that BC now has a tax system where the rich pay a lower provincial tax rate than the rest of us. In 2000, most BC households paid about the same total tax rate, with the richest 10% paying a little bit more. By 2010, however, the tax system had become out-and-out regressive. The higher your income in BC, the lower your overall tax rate, and the results can be seen in Figure 1. How did this happen? The BC personal income tax system remains mildly progressive, meaning as household income rises, so too does the tax rate. The problem, however, is that in the wake of income tax cuts, BC's public treasury is now much less reliant on income taxes, and those tax cuts benefiting primarily upper income earners. Indeed, the provincial treasury's reliance on income taxes dropped by 1/3 between 2000 and 2010. But the other taxes we pay, sales, carbon, property, and MSP premiums, are not progressive, but rather cost middle and lower income households more as a share of their income. Amazingly, as you see in Figure 2, the provincial treasury now relies more heavily on sales tax income than it does on income tax, and even more shockingly, collects more from MSP premiums than it does from corporate income taxes. The net result is a profoundly regressive tax shift. For example, as of 2010, a household in the bottom 20% of the income spectrum pays total provincial taxes of about 14 to 15% of their income. A middle income household pays taxes of approximately 13%, and the wealthiest 20% pay a total provincial tax rate of about 11%. And while total taxes are down for all British Columbians, we have not all benefited equally. Tax cuts were between 2000 and 2010 delivered an average $9,000 per year to the richest 10% of BC households, and a whopping $41,000 to the top 1%. In contrast, middle-income households received an average tax cut of about $1,200, and lower incomes got approximately $200 per year, savings that are most likely wiped out by increases in hydro and other fees. A big reason for these huge differences is the growing gap in earnings and income. The wealthiest 1% of British Columbian households now have an average annual income of about $820,000, and consequently have benefited greatly from tax cuts. Our provincial tax system, instead of helping to offset the growing income gap, is now contributing to the divide. These tax cuts come at a price: foregone government revenues and reduced public services. In short, tax cuts equal service cuts. Between 2000 and 2010, BC's tax revenues fell by 1.7% of the GDP. And that may sound like a small change, but it's equivalent to approximately $3.4 billion a year. Money that is no longer available to reduce the deficit or to spend on much-needed public services. It's time for the provincial government to restore fairness to our tax system. A fair tax commission should be initiated. Such a commission should engage British Columbians in a broad, deliberative approach, such as occurred with the Conversation on Health or the Citizens' Assembly of Electoral Reform, and examine A, how much money we need to raise in order to fund the services and infrastructure we want to pay for together, and B, how to raise these revenues in an equitable and efficient manner. We need to look at the system as a whole and figure out how to make it fair. So what could be done with $3.4 billion a year if tax revenues were restored to 2000 level, increasing by 1.7% of the GDP, which would add approximately $3.4 billion a year to BC tax revenues? As Susan Lambert, president of the BC Teachers Federation, stated in her submission to this committee, it would take an increase of $609 million annually to BC's education system to bring BC in line with the Canadian average spending on K-12 education. The Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC estimate that it would cost $1.5 billion annually to fully implement the early care and learning system for children under the age of 6. We could also restore funding to Community Living BC, the $20 million that was removed, to reopen closed, specialized care homes to foster independent living for physically and mentally challenged adults. We could increase the funding for social and cooperative housing projects, which have seen no growth in the past 10 years, and many are about to see their subsidized housing agreements expire, leaving the residents vulnerable to the market pressures of Vancouver rental rates. Increasing social assistance rates to address the crushing effects of long-term poverty. The Raise the Rate statistics state that it costs twice as much to maintain poverty in BC, $8 to $9 billion, as it would to end poverty, $4 billion. Increased support for seniors, reducing rising residential care rates, reducing the number of surgeries cancelled, and reimbursing them for on an income prorated basis for the $800 to $1,000 in that the HST takes out of their out-of-pocket expenses annually. We could also consider a reduction to BC's post-secondary tuition fees, which are at the highest level on record, and we also have the highest student loan interest rate in all of Canada. We could add more funding for health care, and not from further increases to the MSP premium that in effect becomes a further tax on the poor. We could reinstate funding, which was removed last year, of $26 million, to income assistance of all kinds that address women living in poverty, particularly to rape crisis centers, so that women are not forced to stay in abusive relationships as a result of having no safe houses, crisis centers, or adequate legal aid services to provide the counseling and support they need to start new lives for themselves and their children. We could also restore the cuts of approximately $50 million this year to existing child care and support for children with special needs and legal aid that will further BC's reputation of not adequately caring for its children. Without this, we will remain, for the 6th year running, the province in Canada with the highest child poverty rate in the country. So it should be obvious to all that there are ample social and community obligations that are in dire need of additional funding. Increasing taxes to address these needs, and not on the lowest and middle income earners, is a necessity if we are to reduce the inequity gap between the top 10% and the bottom 20% of income earners in British Columbia.